Hey, welcome to episode 171 of Awkwardly Awesome Podcast. That's just a fun number to say, 171. Um, Today, let me tell you about my guest. So I texted my guest this week a few days ago or a week ago, maybe. I'm curious in what ways has being a journalist changed how you approach everyday non work related conversations? This was yes, I texted him this and he promptly answered. Certainly, I'm more curious about people and their stories, and I might ask about things others wouldn't be comfortable asking about. I was so intrigued, especially since it's easy to get stuck in what's with friends, family, and coworkers when we feel like we've run out of new and interesting things to say or talk about. We might even question whether or not we are boring to be around in the shared uncomfortable silence. Have you ever felt that way? This all is, it can feel so real, but it's simply an illusion. With curiosity, we can discover new questions to ask of the people who surround us. Then we can listen as the answers lead us into whole new conversations. So with that, let me bring on Steve Young, but first this. Nope. No, let me try that again. I'm going to work magic here, but sometimes it takes a bit. But first, this.
Today's guest, Steve Young.
Hey, Steve Young. Welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me back, Jason. It's been a year since we last talked, and I'm a little amazed that time goes that fast. But here we are again, having a conversation. I'm always happy to do that with you.
I'm so pleased to have you back. Have you ever noticed you have the same name as a famous football player?
When I started at the Argus Leader back in 1982, and through the 80s, especially through the 80s, of course, there's this quarterback that plays football for the San Francisco 49ers. And it wasn't unusual when I'd go to bed at night, especially on a Saturday night, that some of the boys would be getting home from the bars or leaving the bars at 2 o'clock in the morning on a Sunday morning. And some knothead would decide to look in the phone book and see there was a Steve Young. And so my phone would ring at 2 o'clock in the morning.
What?
And this probably happened 3 or 4 times, and inevitably they kind of stumble through this monologue that, hey, Steve, why are you talking on the phone at 2 in the morning? Why aren't you in bed getting sleep, getting ready for tomorrow's big game? Ha ha ha, and then slam the phone down. And I mean, I tell people that if you're 35 years or older, you probably know the name Steve Young. You probably connected to the football player with the 49ers. And
so he like was on some Super Bowl teams, right?
Oh yeah, he won at least 1 or 2 Super Bowls, and You know, again, if I'm in a store, if I'm getting the car fixed, if I'm doing anything, and they ask me my name, and I tell them Steve Young, then their eyelids kind of go up, and they go, "Oh, you're not that Steve Young, are you?" And I tell them I'm not that Steve Young, but I was Steve Young before Steve Young was Steve Young. I'm older than him, so I lay claim to the name, and he stole it from me.
So does he have to pay royalties to you on his name?
He should. You know, the only problem is if you look in the phone book, for example, there was a famous coach at the University of Sioux Falls named Bob Young. He had a son, Steve Young. There was a famous CBS reporter, Steve Young. I mean, I dare say out of the 330 million people in the United States, there's probably 10, 20,000 Steve Young. So they would not only be paying royalties to me, they'd be paying them to a lot of other people too.
So some people spend a lot of time spelling their last names and stuff for people. I bet you've never had that problem.
You know, I suspect in this world today, especially like if you're in medical profession or credit cards or banking, whatever, it must be mandated that you spell your last name. And so a lot of times people say your last name, I'll say Young, and they say, how do you spell that? And I try not to shake my head, but I say Young. Oh, Young. Okay, yeah. And, that's fine. I mean, I'd rather them get it right than not ask the question. So, yeah, I got a pretty simple name to remember.
As I'm intrigued how journalism has helped you cultivate a sense of curiosity with life. But I'm wondering, as a kid, do you think you were naturally curious, or was that something you learned?
I think I was always naturally curious. My parents tell the story that when we would go on vacations and I was 6 or 7 years old, one of the things that I used to do, like for example, if we went to Washington, D.C., and we went to Arlington National Cemetery, they would lose track of me because I would be off with a pen and a paper writing down the names on the tombstones and if there was any kind of biographical information included on the tombstone, I was writing down that. Cemeteries are interesting to me. They tell a lot of fabulous stories. I've been into dozens and dozens in South Dakota, and a lot of tombstones might indicate, Mary Jones and her two children died in a fire June 14th, 1891. I mean, all that, just it instilled in me this natural curiosity about who people are, what their stories are, what their lives were all about. So I was doing that at age 7 or 8, and I was doing a lot of other weird things. I'd walk around writing down license plate numbers for some reason. You might have thought I was going to become a policeman or something, but I guess I like to write, and B, that curiosity just kind of followed me all the way through my childhood into adulthood.
So a lot of kids, I guess I'm speaking for myself. I was kind of afraid of cemeteries and thought they were such different places as a kid. But do you remember how you got over that fear, or was there ever a fear that this is a place that's kind of unusual?
I don't remember ever being fearful going into cemeteries. Now, mind you, I wasn't wandering around cemeteries at 10 o'clock at night or anything like that. But, like a lot of people in South Dakota, all over the country, I participated a lot in Memorial Day activities. Our families would go to these rural cemeteries up near Huron. I would hear stories about relatives buried there whether they were killed in the Korean War, whether they came over from Denmark and homesteaded the land, whether one distant cousin was on the cover of Life. So, I mean,
One wait. One distant cousin was on the cover of Life.
Life magazine, right? Life did a feature on farm life, and they found this farm girl up by Carpenter, South Dakota, and they put her picture on the magazine cover and wrote a story about it. And again, a family heirloom that's been handed down. I'm not exactly sure which of my siblings has that magazine now, but all those stories, again, out of the cemeteries or whatever, just kind of ignited this curiosity in me to learn more about people, and not just when they were in cemeteries, obviously, but as they live and breathe and live today.
So that brings up a question. Out of all the farm families in the United States, I wonder how Life magazine found your distant cousin.
I would suspect that maybe there was somebody that worked for Life magazine, and when they pitched the idea of concentrating on farm life, maybe that staffer or whoever it was, secretary, I don't know, maybe knew of this woman, maybe was a friend of hers, and said, hey, I know somebody that fits the bill, and I think she'd be a good candidate for this. And I would guess that's how they found it. I don't know the true story behind that, but that would be a good guess for me.
With journalism in cemeteries, it's interesting the dance between some things are illuminated in any article and some things are illuminated when you go walking in a cemetery. But then there's so many questions that just don't get answered.
One Memorial Day when I was at the Argus Leader, I pitched the idea of finding what I called a pioneer cemetery, finding a cemetery that did not have a lot of people, had a lot of old tombstones in them, and just telling the story of Memorial Day of a community, if you will, that kind of homesteaded this land and were our ancestors back at the time of statehood. And I found one down by T, South Dakota. Yeah, T, South Dakota. In fact, it's probably 6-7 miles west of T. And I think it's called the Pioneer Cemetery. And there were probably, 20, 25 tombstones in there. And I contacted neighbors that lived around that cemetery. I contacted some of the local historians in T, and fortunately, I was able to find out most of the people, their names and what their stories were. And so I went and interviewed relatives, either by phone or in person, and heard all kinds of fascinating stories about life. A century ago, there were little kids buried in that cemetery that had gotten into different kinds of farm chemicals and stuff that were popular back a century ago, swallowed them, maybe died.
Oh, wow.
Kids that families that, tuberculosis went through and wiped out 3 or 4 kids, families involved in a fire. I think there were a couple of war veterans from the Spanish-American War. But again, you don't get all of that just looking at the tombstones. You got to dig, no pun intended. You got to dig a little deeper.
Pun intended.
Yeah, and find the stories. And again, I've always had a fascination with history, and it was just fun, to go back to another era. What the challenges of that era was, and tell those stories, and I was pretty happy with the results.
Conversations are so interesting because I sure didn't expect 15 minutes in we would be talking about cemeteries, but it's fascinating, and I really didn't expect this next question, but your story of just contacting neighbors brought it up. So many of us have a fear of talking to people we don't know, or calling people we don't know, and things like that. How did you ever have that fear? And if you did, how did you get through that fear?
You know, if you're going to be a journalist, and you're going to cover the news, you're going to end up inevitably covering tragic news, and that news might involve somebody who dies in a fire, somebody who is shot and killed, somebody who's in a car accident, you know, lots of different tragedies is part of the fabric of life, if you will. And so if you're assigned to, my philosophy was always, you know, this person died. You might consider them a statistic, a fire death statistic or an accident statistic or whatever, but they have a story. They were somebody, and there's somebody that's worth remembering. And so, you know, I would knock on a door, I would get on the phone, and it wasn't unusual. Journalism has a need to be immediate, and so if somebody has passed away in tragic circumstances in the last day or so, that sense of immediacy means that I have to be on the phone while they're still grieving and see if they want to talk about their loved one. And I would tell you, Jason, that about, I don't know, maybe half the time, maybe a little bit less, people would be angry. They would really let me know that they didn't appreciate me calling them at such a terrible, tragic time. And I mean, whenever a national figure dies, families always put out this statement that says, "Please respect our privacy at this time, and don't bother us." Well, journalism is a bit in the bothering mode, I'm afraid. But what I found out is for every one or two people that got mad and slammed the phone down on me, I would get somebody on the phone who would, or when I knocked on the door, that said, "You know what? My son was somebody, my daughter was somebody, my husband was somebody, and I do want to talk to you about who they were and the things they did and the things they accomplished." And to be honest, it developed for me, it created for me some pretty good stories. I think it was also fairly therapeutic for them to be able to, at a time of grief, to remember the good things about their loved one and to share those. And so, you do that enough times, and I was at the Argus Leader for 35 years. You develop a thick enough skin to know that somebody might slam the phone down on you, but that a lot of times they're going to open their doors, they're going to stay on the phone, and they're going to be glad that they shared that story. And to be honest, I've had different moments in my life where having called somebody on the phone, talked to them about a loved one who has died, has opened other doors for me. So I mean, that just told me that they were happy I called them, and that I took an interest in their loved one.
So in life, we like to avoid hard things, but if you had got if you had responded to getting the phone slammed down a bunch of times by saying, "Yeah, I'm not going to deal with these stories about people who have died," all those people who you wrote stories about their loved ones would have missed out on having stories written about their loved ones and their loved ones honored in such a way.
Yeah, um, I covered the execution of Donald Moeller at the state penitentiary. Donald Moeller killed a little 8-year-old girl up in the north side of Sioux Falls, and I covered his execution. And before he died, before he was executed, I was assigned to do a profile on who Donald Moeller is, and to write about him. And I got a hold of his sister and his stepmother. And again, I got him on the phone. They were living in a community down south of Sioux Falls, not far. And they were upset. They were angry. You know, how dare I call them? You know, you're just another, headline-seeking journalist, and how dare you do this? And they would not talk to me. Now, I ended up talking to a lot of people about Donald Moeller. I talked to the law enforcement people who investigated him. I talked to neighbors of his. I talked to friends of his that knew him. And I wrote a story about this guy who murdered an 8-year-old girl, but who who had absolutely just a terrible childhood, raised by a mother that used to send him out to steal stuff from people's houses, slept on the floor in a dirty, a moldy mattress. If he didn't bring stuff home that his mother wanted him to steal, she would hit him with pans and everything else. And so I wrote, you know, how basically in South Dakota, this is how you create a monster. This is how you create a killer. He gets raised in a house that has no love in it and has a lot of abuse in it. And the story ran, and after the story ran, the mother and the stepmother and the sister contacted me and apologized for not talking to me in the first place, said they wish they had talked now that they knew what I was doing. And that, you know, I didn't paint this guy as an angel, but I painted, you know, what life was like for him growing up. And I think they appreciated the fact that people saw that, you know, their stepson and brother, sure, he did a terrible thing, but he really had no chance from the time he was born of ever turning into anything else. And you know, there's an argument that you know, a lot of people have bad childhoods and they don't end up becoming killers, and Donald Moeller did. And I understand that philosophy, but on the other hand, we would have a lot fewer people that end up like Donald Moeller being executed if family life wasn't as ugly as it can be in this state and other states.
It's such a powerful full story. I mean that stepmother and daughter, right?
Stepmother and Donald Moeller's sister, yeah.
That stepmother and sister I mean, it's unbelievable to think what they had to go through and everything, and you were able to write a story that showed that this person who was huge in their lives as a human being who made really bad decisions and did an awful thing, but you were able to show him as a human being.
Right. And you know, I didn't sugarcoat him by any means. I pointed out all the evil that was within him. Again, I pointed out the terrible childhood he had. And when I went to the prison for the night of the execution, I heard from the sheriff and from the police that investigated him, and they all, you know, were very complimentary, saying, you know, that's a story that needs to be told. People need to understand, you know, that there is evil in this state, and it just doesn't necessarily pop up on its own, that there are family circumstances and other things that create these monsters. And so they were glad I did it. I was glad I got people. And, you know, at one point I interviewed, I don't know if he was a friend or a cousin or something like that. And the cousin called me back a day or two later and said, you know what, my wife, I told her that I talked to you. My wife says, why do you want the world to know that we're related to Donald Moeller? That's just going to cause us, you know, problems. People know that we're related. They're going to be upset with us. So you call him back and tell him that you don't want your name in the paper. He called me back, and you know, I'm not in the business to ruin other people's lives, so I didn't put his name in the paper. But I mean, you know, it was an example again to me that I'm always happy when people talk to me. I also understand that when the story's done, I walk away to the next story. The people I write about, they deal with whatever I've written in the paper, and it could be good, it could be bad, it could be ugly, it could be all of that. And so I was always cognizant that whatever I wrote, it could have an impact on somebody's life. And so if they said no, I don't want that, I honored that. I didn't. I tried not to make people's lives harder than they may or may not already be.
So in every profession, there's a range of philosophies and ethics and in journalism that there's too. Like, so how do you how do you show the people you wanted to interview in a fairly short time that you would treat them as well as you could, that you weren't trying to ruin their lives?
Yeah, it wasn't. I wasn't letting people read my stories before they went into the paper. That's just not something journalists do. But if I was dealing with something that was particularly delicate or controversial, I mean, I was more than happy to call people back and say, okay, I've got this section of the story where you're talking about this or this, and I know you have strong opinions. This is the quote. This is what I say. Are you all right with it? I would say 90% of the time, people would say, yeah, I'm all right with that. 10% of the time, they might say, I wish you would take that out, or I wish you would change what I said. So, I didn't let people read the stories, but I would let them, I would read back to them and let them know some of what I was doing. Part of it is just when you sit down, it used to bother me, especially with television journalism, because, the television journalists would show up in their suit and ties with their cameras at somebody's doorstep at a time of sadness or tragedy and need a 10-second soundbite. I always thought when you interviewed somebody, and particularly if there was death involved or something like that, you needed to take the time to sit and listen. I mean, it's good to be able to ask good probing questions, but it's even better to be a good listener.
It's good to be able to ask probing questions, but it's even better to be a good listener.
It
Wow.
is. In the mid '80s, we went through a farm crisis, and the governor at the time, Bill Janko, took the whole legislature, the whole South Dakota legislature, to Washington D.C. to talk to Congress about what we needed in South Dakota to keep farmers on the land, and the prices and loans were going bad and everything else. And I went to Ethan, South Dakota, and I went to a farmhouse, and the farmer there and his wife, they invited like the school principal, the banker, the grocery store owner, the neighbor to all come and sit around this table and talk. And we talked for a long time, and I listened for a long time about the problems they were going through. And when it was all over, I was not in a hurry to leave. The banker, the principal, the businessman all left, but I just sat at the table talking to this farmer and his wife. And the farmer had to go out and do something, I don't know, in the barn. And the wife started talking about how she worried about her husband, that she worried that the stress of the farm crisis was weighing on him. She actually said that she worried that some nights she'd be laying in bed next to him and she'd hear a gunshot go off, and she was afraid he would kill himself. And I mean, I could have, at the end of that conversation, got up and walked out with everybody else. But again, I always felt like, staying, listening, showing an interest always got you a little bit farther on a story, always maybe helped you get a better story. And when I did that story, I asked her about it. I said, that's a powerful story. Do you mind if I use it? she thought about it a little bit, and she said, yeah, that's fine. And so I've got this powerful story about what the farm crisis is doing to farmers in South Dakota. And it leads with a woman talking about laying in bed at night awake, waiting for that gunshot. I mean, it was just a powerful
Wow.
image. So it definitely paid to be a good listener.
That brings up the art of listening. How do you learn to listen well? It seems like it should be so easy, but it's not.
Yeah, listening really plays off the questions, I guess. If I'm talking to somebody about a race they ran, a marathon, and they're talking about, worried about who's behind them, worrying about how fast they're going to run, and worrying about tripping over a pothole in the road, okay, a pothole in the road. Never thought of that when you were running. When you're running a marathon, do you have to worry about potholes in the road? Sure, you got to worry about speed bumps. You got to worry about, all of a sudden they're telling you stories about, that running a marathon isn't just putting one foot in front of the other for 26. There's all kinds of things that can happen in the course of, people lining the roads. Somebody wants to give you a drink of water. They get in front of you. You trip over them. I mean, you listen for the answers that you expect to hear, but you also, have to have a keen ear for the kinds of things that kind of come out of the blue and that make you think, wow, I never thought about that. And having never thought about it, I better ask some more questions about that. And you just develop that. I developed that over 35 years of again, mainly, Jason, just, obviously there are times you have to be in a hurry. You've got a deadline. You got to get something done. But a lot of the times the features, the projects I worked on, I was afforded the opportunity to listen, to really spend time listening. That I think helped me more than anything was not being in a hurry. And again, if I was talking to somebody about road racing, they have other things going on in their lives that, well, when you're not running, when you're not training, what do you do for fun, type stuff. And then they might go down a road of, I go down to Mexico and I do cliff diving and what? You do what? And I mean, listening involves just not listening for the answers questions you need answers. It's listening to, it's asking questions and listening to all kinds of, they might seem like simple, plain questions, but you always get fascinating answers. And it's a cliche, and everybody says it, that everybody has a story. And in fact, everybody I found in all my time, I think everybody does have a story. You have a story. My friends have a story. It's just that nobody takes time to talk about it and listen to them. And when you do that, I mean, you get all kinds of great stories.
You said such a great description of listening, a powerful listening a few minutes ago. So you said you listen for what you expect to hear, but you also listen for what comes out of the blue.
Right.
So you do both.
Yeah.
Huh?
Yeah. And again, like the farm wife talking about her husband, I mean, that was totally out of the blue. I mean, I would have never imagined, as we were discussing the farm crisis, that I would have a woman tell me that story. And it becomes, in my mind, one of the most powerful pieces of the whole story. And of course, suicide during the farm crisis was not unusual. It was happening a lot. And in fact, there were times when I went out, when I would approach a farm family, and because I knew there was a death, and I would be told it was suicide related, and I would contact them and I'd say, okay, I know you lost your husband. I know these are difficult times. Are you willing to talk to me about what the difficulties are, what the answers are for those difficulties, and how this has impacted your family? And I had a number of times when people said, "Yeah, come on out. I want to talk to you about that." And they would describe the struggles. They would describe, the anxiety, the sleepless nights. They would describe how their loved one said he was going out to feed the hogs and didn't come back. And hours later, they find his body in the barn. I mean, powerful, powerful stories. And again, um, I mean, it's difficult to approach people on those kinds of things. But again, as I said before, a lot of times they want to talk. They want to tell that story. They want their loved one. My loved one wasn't just a suicide victim. I mean, he was the head of the school board. He taught Sunday school. He won these awards. He had a tremendous story. And sure, we talk about what led to his death, but we humanize this person too in a way that, again, I think everybody needs to be humanized, and their stories need to be told.
What would you say to those of us not in journalism about about having harder conversations with with the people around us? Sometimes it's so tempting to sing and dance on a big issue even. We often don't ask people about loved ones who have died because we don't want to bring up hard times, and there's a lot of situations like that.
There are, and again, you will find that a lot of people don't want to talk about it, and whether it's grandpa in World War II or grandpa in the Vietnam War, they don't want to talk about it. It's interesting. It seems like at the end of their lives, soldiers from whatever war start breaking down and talking about it. And I, to be honest, I did a lot of great, I thought, stories on military experiences that were not told to me by the person that was in the war, but it was told to me by a son or a daughter who was sitting by the edge of the bed as dad died. And dad told him how, he went up the mountain at Iwo Jima and the bullets ricocheting all around and his best friend getting shot. I remember one story where this guy had a really good friend in a unit in Vietnam, and they were out in the jungle and they were attacked by the Vietnamese, and the friend got hit. And as he got hit, he's laying in this field in the jungle and he's screaming for his mother because he's dying. And I guess it's not uncommon when you're facing the end of life and you're far from home, you cry out for the ones you love the most. This guy that I interviewed said, his screaming for his mother was giving up their location. The Viet Cong were all zeroing in on where this was going. So this guy had to go out and put his hand over his friend's mouth and keep him from screaming so that the Viet Cong couldn't find their position. And as he does that, the guy dies in his arms. And again, he hadn't told that story. I always counted a blessing that they would want to share something like that with me. But again, they get on later in life. They've been through some tremendous experiences, some terrible experiences. And at some point, maybe their family never asked them about it. Maybe they always told them, I just don't want to talk about it. But at some point, it seems like it wasn't uncommon for me to get stories from people who were either finally reconciled to the fact that I need to share some of this with somebody, or died and shared it with a family member, and then the family member shared it with me. Part of what I found was that the more stories I wrote, the more I had published, the more people got to know my style and my writing and all that. It seemed like in later years they maybe felt a little more comfortable if I called or knocked on a door and I said I was Steve Young. You know, this was back in the day when the Argus Leader sold 80,000 papers on a Sunday and 50,000 on a weekday. Everybody was reading the paper. They saw the bylines. They knew who was writing. And so the farther I got into my career, it seemed like the more that helped me out get into to houses to tell stories and listen to these fabulous memories and things that people had.
Wow. So that brings us to a bit of a transition of topics. So what has it been like for you seeing the newspapers like the Argus Leader go from being one thing in the 80s to what they are at the moment?
You know, it's heartbreaking, Jason.
It's heartbreaking.
It's heartbreaking. And, you know, I know the people that are at the Argus now, they're not even in that building anymore. They've moved into a little office over by the Canaries baseball stadium. I know they're
Really?
trying. Yeah, I know they're trying to
Wow.
do the best job they can, but it really is heartbreaking. You know, today I was on my computer and I was looking at some headlines, and I saw a headline that said Sports Illustrated fired all their employees today. They let everybody off.
What?
Sports Illustrated,
What?
yeah, they've released all their employees. And, you know, when I was growing up in Huron and I was like 10, 11, 12, 13, I read Sports Illustrated all the time. I mean, they had writers that were just absolutely the best writers, I thought, in the world. Guys like Frank DeFord, Dan Jenkins, um, Sally Jenkins, Lee Montville. I mean, these guys wrote long, in-depth stories that talked not just about the sports these guys were excelling in, but their lives. And the words they used were just magic. And to be honest, when I graduated from here in high school, my goal, my ambition was to write for Sports Illustrated. And I told a couple of sports editors I worked for, both in here in Brookings, that was my goal someday, to write for Sports Illustrated. And so I've watched newspapers disappear. I've seen them go online. I've seen them lose staffs. And you know, it's broken my heart seeing it. Now I see Sports Illustrated. And I mean, I am just absolutely crushed because, I mean, I have always been a fan of great journalism, great writing, and it's still out there. But I mean, all these publications that are going away, just you know, I cringe at the thought that the way I'm going to get my news in the future is online, on the internet, with different bloggers and online sites that may or may not. You know, we practiced accuracy, and if we weren't accurate, we corrected it. How do you know anymore when you're online if something's accurate or not? So I mean, the demise of the newspaper and magazines has just absolutely been crushing to me.
It, so such a loss, and when there's a loss, things start to slowly take its place. Will you please talk a little about freelance journalism and
Sure,
what's emerging to
sure.
take the place of all this, of all we've lost?
Sure. You know, there are a lot of great journalists in Sioux Falls that spent a lot of years at Kello or at KSFY or at the Argus Leader, and they've all been part of this downsizing. And you know, it's not like as they lay people off at the Argus, you can go to Des Moines or Omaha or somewhere else and find a job there, because they're all laying people off. And so those that are very passionate about journalism have created their own niches here in South Dakota. The former editors at the Argus Leader, Randall Beck and Jack Marsh, started a publication called South Dakota News Watch, and they do this tremendous in-depth investigative reporting on politics, on state government, on city government, on things going on in the city. And a lot of other groups have followed. There's a South Dakota Searchlight that does a lot of the same thing. There's a Sioux Falls Live that's affiliated with Fargo. Fargo Communications has kind of evolved into the Sioux Falls Mitchell market. So they're doing stories. I do a lot of freelance writing for a woman named Jody Schwan, who used to be at Kello, used to be at the Argus. She's got a couple of online publications. One of them's on business and one of them's on human interest. And the great thing there with Jody is she'll call me up. She knows I'm retired. She knows I have time. She knows I like to do stories that aren't necessarily negative, but you know, prop up this community, tell good stories going on in this community, tell us, you know, stories about people making a difference in this community. And so she'll call me up and say, okay, I'll give you some examples. There's a farm down by Lenox called the Good Earth Farm. And these people take in animals. You know, if a hog is injured or a dog is injured or some ducks, you know, got their wings damaged, they'll take them to this farm and they'll take care of them. Somebody brought them a deer, and you know, you're not supposed to domesticate deers. You're supposed to let them go free, and you know, Mother Nature will do whatever they will with it.
Will it?
Deer.
Is that a law or what
Yeah,
is
well,
it?
yeah, you're not supposed to domesticate them, and you know, sometimes people will have a deer, they'll put a collar on them to track them where they're going. The game fishing park says no, you shouldn't do that. But these people took in this deer. I mean, they're not the kind of people that were going to put the deer down, euthanize it. They perhaps hoped that they could find another home for it. They didn't. Well, this deer starts showing up at their farm all the time. They're feeding it cereal. They're feeding it popsicles. They're feeding it all kinds of different. They're giving it milk. All of a sudden, it starts showing up at their door. Wants to come in the kitchen, get something to eat. At their farm, they have a barn, and they sell pizza and stuff out of the barn. They have community functions at this barn, and people will come for pizza or something. The deer will wander around. People will pet it, take selfies with it. So I mean, there are just interesting stories. Again, everybody has a story, and that story was an interesting one to me. So Jody called me up and asked me to do that. But you know, there are a lot of other things. We have a lot of great nonprofits in this community that, for example, there's a laundromat up on North Cliff where this group called Church on the Street will show up a couple of Wednesdays a month and with a big bag of coins, and they invite all the low-income needy people to come in and do their laundry, and they'll pay for it, and they pay for it. And what that means is that a child who's been going to school, who hasn't had their clothes washed in a couple of weeks, who's been bullied because maybe they smell, now they're getting their dignity back because this group is paying to get their laundry done. You know, these single mothers that, you know, used to have to try and wash clothes in a kitchen sink, couldn't wash bed sheets for months and months. Now they can come in and these people will pay, you know, they raise their money through different churches contributing to it, and then they do this laundry. And I mean, it's just neat things like that, different groups doing neat things like that, that really get kind of to the heart of community journalism to me. I mean, to me, community journalism was always about what's going on in your community, not in Aberdeen or Minneapolis or Omaha, but what are the neat things that people are doing in your town? What are the neat stories they have? And Jody does a good job of finding a lot of different neat things that are going on that I think the community needs to hear. And fortunately, sometimes when they hear about it and they hear about the good work, then they donate to it. They make it stronger. You know, they allow them to do more. And I think that's what our community needs. And I feel like maybe I'm helping that by having a chance to do some of this freelance activity.
Being a journalist, I mean, obviously you see a lot of tragedy and hard stuff, but it sounds like in your career you've seen and written about a tremendous amount of kindness too.
I have, and one of the slams, if you will, against journalism is all they do is write about tragedy and bad things. There's never any positive news. And the fact of the matter is we write a lot of positive stories. We tell a lot of neat things about things that people are doing, and maybe they get overshadowed. Maybe the bad news is the headline on the top of the first page. The good news maybe is until the third or fourth page, but it's in there. I used to go out to the reservations a lot and do stories on tribal life in South Dakota. And there's a lot you can write about tribal life that's not very happy, between the gangs, the alcoholism, the crime. But I always loved going out, finding the people that were making a difference on the reservations, whether they were growing community gardens to feed people or whether they, we're working with the banks to get loans for people to improve their houses. I mean, I think, again, the farther I got into my career and the more stories that I tried to do, telling not only about the difficulties, but about the good news on the reservations, the more doors that opened up to me and the more good stories I got to tell. And so, you see it on Kellerland. Kellerland has a thing called Positively Kellerland, where they're featuring positive things in the community. And I think in whatever form journalism exists today in this community, I think we need to do more of that kind of thing.
It sounds like you've really been very devoted to covering people not just as one-dimensional beings, but covering people's many dimensions, which is amazing.
Yeah, and you know, I I I used to, and this is kind of the cemetery guy in me coming back to haunt me, if you will. But I used to read the obituaries every day in the paper, and I think a lot of people read the obituaries in newspapers. They get up and they look to see if their name is in the obituaries, and if it's not in the obituaries, then they go on with their day. They kind of. But obituaries again is a fascinating read, not only because you learn about the lives of people, but one of the last stories I did, there was a guy that died who had lived in the Ukraine, and his family was involved in Russian invasion and all this and that, and he had a tremendous story. The problem for me was that he had died, and so I reached out to a number of people, his pastor, I think a sister or a sister-in-law or something like that. And I mean, they tell stories about this guy and the incredible things he went through in his youth. I wish I'd have known him when he was alive. But part of being a journalist, getting a good story is you got to look in a lot of different places. You got to look in cemeteries. You got to look in obituaries. I would read all the weekly newspapers. I would read the letters to the editor. I mean, all of those were great sources for good news, for not so good news, but I mean, compelling news that people needed to hear and know about. You just learn over time that there are a lot of different places to find a story, to find a good story, and you cultivate those as much as you can, and I did.
So as we wrap up, changing subjects once again, if someone listening is contacted by a journalist, what are some general things they should know about giving an interview that's useful to the journalist?
Well, I would want to ask the journalist, okay, what's the story? What are you hoping to get at? Are you trying to paint my loved one as some kind of scoundrel, or are you going to tell his story in a fair and accurate way? you know, if I tell you something and you use it, will you? I don't expect you to let me read the whole story, but will you tell me what you use in that story and how you're using it? Um, I would say, if there's not a sense of urgency to it, I would say, can you email me maybe some of the stories you've done in the past so I can see the kind of work you've done and get a sense of what kind of journalist you are? All of those are I think, fair questions to ask a journalist. And I suspect that a good journalist will say, sure, I'll do all of the above. A bad journalist, and bad's not maybe the right word, but a journalist that says, I don't have time. You either have to talk to me now or we can't talk. I'd say, okay, then goodbye and thanks for your time. But, I wouldn't, it wouldn't be against anything to question a journalist a little bit about who you are, what you've done, what you're going to do with it, and how you're going to, how do you intend to portray and all this and that. And again, I don't want to bash the media, but, if I talk to you for a half an hour and you use 15 seconds, that's not necessarily going to get a story out on my loved one or whatever. On the other hand, people like to be on TV. So, I mean, a lot of people may talk to a TV journalist just because of the fact that they're going to get 10 seconds of fame on a TV station. But, I just, one of the freelance stories I recently had, there's a woman who's a seamstress in town who has built a church in Vietnam. She has built this wonderful church, paid for it. She paid for all the building supplies, and then the people in this village built this Catholic church. And this was a village, I think, where people were kept prisoner during the war and all this and that. So it's very rural and isolated. It's a tremendous story. I went to her shop to ask if I could do a freelance story on her. She showed me some pictures of what she had done, and she said, I'm busy, but I'll call you back. Well, she didn't call me back. And so a week or two later, I went back, said, hey, I'm still interested in doing that story. She says, yeah, I've got your number. I'm busy, but I'll get back to you. Well, the bell went off in my head, and I could tell that this woman was not going to share her story with me. The I'm busy was kind of a way of telling me that go away. I don't want to do this. I do wish that people, and again, people have slammed the phone in my ear, so I know they know how to answer the reporter. I wish sometimes that when they didn't want to talk to me, and I would try and tell them this, I'd say, if you don't want to talk to me, that's fine. I won't bother you anymore. But sometimes, like this woman, they kind of give you hope, and then it takes 2 or 3 times before it finally dawns on you that this story is going nowhere. And interestingly enough, in this freelance work, I've had 3 or 4 of those just in the last couple of months, and they're all fairly positive, not controversial stories. But I think in cases like that, if people told the journalist that, what, I'm not interested, but thanks anyway, I think that's the best thing they could do, at least from my perspective.
How about within the actual interview? Is there what's the balance between someone being interviewed talking too much and not talking enough?
People like to talk. If they agree to an interview, they like to talk. And when I do the freelance work, I will record every interview. I'm past the days of trying to scribble notes on a notepad because I can't read most of it anyway by the time I get home. So, I will tell people that I need about a 15-minute interview on a story I'm doing, and I'll go and interview them. It'll be an hour long by the time we get done. And again, in large part because I like to listen, and I get the question. I'll write questions out I want to ask, and I'll get them asked. But then I'm interested in hearing more, and so I don't do a very good job, Jason, of telling people, okay, we got to cut this off. Again, I'm retired. I'm not on any timeline. So if somebody rambles and rambles, I expect that with the territory now. I don't really, if people that give very short answers that don't talk, that just means as a good journalist, you have to rephrase the question or come up with a different way of asking the question. If somebody says, I like altering clothes, being a seamstress. I like doing that, and then they stop. Well, then the next question is, well, why do you like doing that? And hopefully they expound on that. And if they give you a 5-word answer, then you got to be quick, and say, okay, so when you do this, this means this, or explain it a little further to me. And sometimes it's like pulling teeth. But again, if you're worth anything as a journalist, you know how to rephrase and re-ask questions until you get an answer that you think works for what you're doing.
Mm-hmm. So thanks so much for spending this time. As I have to admit, before the interview, I was confident leading up to it, but then 15 minutes before, I'm like, hey, what are we going to talk about for a whole hour? But now I realize we could talk for 3 or 4 hours, and just it's so fascinating, and it's so fun how conversations work.
Yeah, I love having conversations. Love visiting with you, Jason. I love talking about journalism.
Hey, thank you. Just one more question, and
Sure.
I asked you this before, but I ask each interview. What does doing your imperfect best mean to you as of today?
I haven't been at the Argus Leader for 8 years. I've been retired for 3 years. I do get to write. I get to do freelance, but it used to be when I was in journalism and talking to schools and talking at the universities, sharing what I do with people. It kind of helped validate that, I was in a profession I loved. People were interested in hearing about it. And maybe people were motivated to do something similar based on what I told them. Being on your show brings back all of that for me, sharing what I do, what I did, and I guess what I still do, why I think it's important, what I think of the state of journalism today. I'm in a retirement world. You don't find a lot of people that have any interest in that, and to be honest, 99% of the people I interact with now don't have any idea what I did. I've been gone long enough that it just doesn't resonate with them that I worked for a newspaper. And so the opportunity to come on here just kind of charges my batteries and keeps me motivated to, at least from a freelance standpoint, stay in the journalism business and keep telling stories and keep the community advised of what a great community it is and the great things going on with it. So that's what your show means to me.
Well, wonderful. Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure, and
okay. Thank you, Jason.
Stories are powerful. Thank you, Steve Young.
Absolutely.
Just it's we human beings have so much to share, and but at the same time, as I was saying in the beginning, it's easy to get stuck in kind of ruts of not knowing what to say to each other. So as Steve mentioned, when you're in conversations with someone, listen for the things you expect them to say, but also listen for the little things that come out of the blue that you don't expect, and get curious about those and ask more questions. And thanks as always for tuning into our Goodly Awesome podcast. Your time is valuable. It's sacred. I'm glad you're spending some of it here feel free to leave a comment if you want. I love seeing comments. So, and thanks for being you. Talk to you next week when I'll have another amazing guest.